Hey guys, Dark Humility here. You can always catch me at twitch.tv/Dark Humility for 6 to 7 days a week of Diablo 2 action. We are going hard on D2R, coming up on Ladder 2, October 6th. I'll be playing hardcore myself, but you can catch me for the action whether you play hardcore or softcore, and even join one of the ladder teams that I am forming on my stream. Of course, you can catch my build guides at Maxroll, maxroll.gg, and of course, on my YouTube, plenty of both D2R and PD2 build guides and commentaries and all kinds of content in general. So today, I'm coming fresh off of testing a new change, a groundbreaking change to the Diablo 2 game, probably even bigger than the Terror Zones, which I noted was probably the biggest change in 12 years. Well, I would say these Sunder Charms complement this nicely because together these two changes possibly make this patch the biggest change to Diablo 2 in 20 years, if not longer. This is one of the craziest things you could ever imagine. It addresses immunities, something people have complained about since the dawn of the game. Sunder Charms. Sunder Charms, which are meant to complement the Terror Zones and to promote build diversity and to make it more likely that more builds will want to farm more of the Terror Zones more of the time. So, let's get into what I think about these. What I'll basically be going over here first is how they work, and then I'll go over what they change, what I think they don't change, and what I would like them to potentially polish or change in order to perhaps promote more positive interactions with these charms just in general. And so, with all that being said, I am here to give you guys some high-level insights through the testing and just through my knowledge of the game in general. It is time for me to impart my wisdom unto the Diablo 2 community, or whoever is willing to listen. And so, let's talk about these because there are a lot of emotions running high. Some people think they change everything. Some people think they don't change much at all because they don't change what they want them to change, like quality of life, like rune stacking, and loot filters, which by the way, I do support. So I can understand how there's all kinds of emotions when it comes to this particular change. And some people think it goes too far, some people think it doesn't go far enough in certain ways. Let's break it all down for you guys. You guys see this document, it's pretty long. Let's go through each point individually and talk about exactly how this works. So first, we're just going to go over how they work, which is going to be a very quick section here, just for people that maybe don't know what Sunder Charms are. So, there are 6 types of Sunder Charms which eliminate immunities to the respective element. All 6 elements: fire, cold, lightning, poison, physical, and magic. Those are the immunities that are possible. Those are the 6 types of damage in the game that can be done by players, and of course, monsters can also do to you. Magic is not poison, fire, lightning, or cold damage. Magic is actually a separate damage category, essentially. So that is one thing that to keep in mind. A lot of people don't actually know that. So, just to kind of clarify what that's about, that's how it is. While also providing a penalty related to receiving damage from that element. So, you can remove a magic immunity with the Magic Sunder Charm. So that'll allow your hammers, for instance, let's say you're a hammered in or a Bone Spear Necro to do damage to an otherwise magic immune monster, but now you'll receive 50% more magic damage from monster magic damage, like from snake bone spears, or from the balls, from things like guardians, maybe part of the damage on witches, which I think is like half physical, half magic damage. At any rate, nasty stuff. So, at any rate, there is a drawback, so it's risk reward. A Sunder Charm eliminates immunities and sets them to 95 resistance of that element. So it sets them to, instead of being immune, now they are 95% resistant, which basically means only 5% of your damage is actually getting through. And then all sources of pierce and negative res take effect afterwards. So this means that if you remove their immunity and they have 95 resistance, and let's say you have infinity, which reduces cold, fire, and lightning resistance by 85, now the monster, if it was, let's say, fire immune, now has only 10 fire resistance left over after both this charm and then infinity is applied. Historically, this is not the case. Historically, if conviction was applied to a fire immune, let's say the monster has 110 fire resistance. In order to break the immune, the infinity conviction would incur a penalty, and only 20% of that negative res would actually take effect. So out of 85, that is negative 17. And that negative 17 would be applied to the 110 resistance, dropping it below 100, making it not immune anymore, but still having 93 fire resistance. So, but now that's not the case. If you have one of these charms in your inventory, you break the immune first, and then all other sources of negative res take effect afterwards, including facets, negative res provided by gear, and these auras, and lower resist, and anything else that can break immunes, like Grimward, whatever. It doesn't matter. It does it. Of course, for physical, amplify damage and decrepify break immunities historically, and they still can. But if you have this charm now, that's just straight negative 100 enemy physical resistance if you're using amplify damage as an example, or negative 50 with decrepify. So this is some serious power that this can provide you against immunities. Before, even if you broke the immunity, it might still be pretty hard to kill the monster, even with an endgame build. Now that's not the case. You can flatten immunities and all other monsters alike with your build, with Reckless Abandon, once you get negative res on top of these charms. These charms do not increase damage of that element, but merely remove immunities. Well, so that's a common misconception, that these charms are just straight up increasing the build's damage. No, it only removes immunities. What does this mean? That means any monster that is not immune to your element will not be affected by this charm whatsoever. So that means areas that don't have these immunes in general, you're not going to get a lot of benefit from this charm. If the entire area is immune, however, you might see a lot of benefit from this charm, but not because your damage is being increased, but because more of it is actually able to get through, and you're actually able to do your damage. That is a very important distinction. Multiple Sunder Charms can be equipped simultaneously alongside Keith's Fortune. So this is a very interesting point. This means that if you have a hybrid build, or you just do multiple types of damage, that you can equip them all in your inventory, every single one. A funny aside, you can actually even equip multiple of the same element Sunder Charm and get the debuff applied multiple times, but you don't see any further benefit because it still just breaks the fire immune. You only sunder the fire immunes. You only get that stat. You only get one of those positive stats, but you can have like negative 225 fire res if you just stack 3 of them in your inventory. So don't do that on hardcore, especially, or anywhere. So that is a very important thing to note here. Also, you will get the debuff from every single charm you have if they are different elements as well. So if you do different elements of damage, you can potentially remove all of the immunities to all of those elements, and then all of your damage gets through against all of the monsters. That is how it can work. So that's pretty cool. And you can also equip them alongside Geed's Fortune, so they don't prevent you from equipping each other or Geed's Fortune. However, a Geed's Fortune will still prevent you from equipping another Geed's Fortune, as including picking it up, so that's still the case. These charms only apply to the character wearing them. Okay, so this is something I tested pretty thoroughly. It is a local stat. It only applies to your own damage. It doesn't remove immunities for other players. I've had other players come in and try to do damage without their own charm on, and then they can't do it. They can only do it if they also have their charm on. So let's say, like, there's a fire immunity, and I have my fire sundering charm on, and I take out the immunity. My party member doesn't have that charm on. They can't do damage. And they're also a fire sorceress. They can't do damage to that monster, but I can. So that is a very important distinction. They don't remove the immunities for the other players in a party. And it doesn't matter if lower resistance or conviction or amp is applied, unless, of course, those break the immunity. If they don't break the immunity, it's still not going to do jack. So lower resistance, conviction, and whatnot can still break immunities for a party, right? For your party, and amplify damage would normally. But they're going to be doing damage as if they don't have the charm. If they had the charm, then those negative enemy res effects would apply after the charm, and then they would do even more damage. But they need the charm. Otherwise, they're doing minimal damage, even if the immunity is broken by conviction, amplify damage, or lower resistance, like it normally would be, because it's receiving the 1/5 penalty for you as a party member that doesn't have the charm. So the charm is local completely. It doesn't apply to mercenary, minion, trap, summon damage. So it doesn't apply to any other party member or anything that's not your character's damage. And that also includes traps and summons. Now we'll talk about that later, but that's a bit of a problem, and that means that certain builds literally do not gain any impact currently from these charms. Now keep in mind that this video is being made literally a day after they just updated the PTR with these Sunder Charms, so it is important to note that, or a day and a half, whatever, maybe, well, I guess it's actually about 2 days, but anyway, it's like 2 days afterwards, okay, day and a half, 2 days, big, same difference. Anyway, you get the idea. If they do make further changes to these points will change, but this is what I'm addressing so far, just so that it is on the record that these are things that have been observed. Alright, Sunder Charms have a level 75 requirement, which is the same level as a Hellfire Torch, which means you cannot use them on a character that is lower than 75. So, it is basically used when, you're at you can use them at the cusp of hell. You get to hell with a 75 character, a lot of players do, and now you can kill stuff, or you can kill any immunities you want with it. And now you're no longer hampered by immunities. You can just kill everything instead of skipping them or whatever. Or just killing them with the mercenary, or just struggling. Alright. One very last very important point here is that these unique grand charms can only drop in terror zones, which are confirmed thus far to be ladder only. So terror zones for the time being, aren't single player, they're not non-ladder, they are ladder only. And since these charms can only drop from Terra zones from unique, super unique, and champion and boss monsters, they are also ladder only. Makes sense. They compete with Geed's Fortune. So the way Diablo 2 works is there are odds for there are set odds that any base item rolls unique. That includes a Grand Charm. It's the same odd for any base item. It's the same odds for any base item to roll unique. So the odds for rolling a Geed's Fortune, as long as they are equal to the Geed's Fortune in their respective odds, should be pretty similar to rolling a Geed's Fortune from one of these monsters in the Terror Zones. So you basically just have 6 types of Sunder Charms on top of the Geed's Fortune. So now there's 7 types of unique Grand Charms that can roll when you pick up a unique Grand Charm. And I'm assuming if you have a Geeds in your inventory and you try to pick up a unique Grand Charm, the surest way to know that it's not a Sunder Charm is that it won't let you pick it up. I'm not 100% sure though. Another thing we're not 100% sure about is whether or not it will be kind of like a Tyrael's Templars situation. And, you know, the odds for one of them is 10%, as I know all too well. And the odds for the other one's 90%. Well, in this case, it could be the Geeds that's like 50% chance, and then the other 50% is distributed among these Sunder Charms. We don't know. Or it could just be equal. There could be a roughly 16% chance of, or 15-ish% chance of getting each one of these charms, including Geeds. Could be just equal. Basically, different items that share the same base have different situations. It could be a Tyrael's Templars situation, but it could also be a Hellfire Torch situation in terms of each class being equal. Or it could be, like a Veil of Steel or Nightwing situation where they are 50-50. And in this case, that would also mean that the odds for each of them is equal. So we don't actually know. But that is important to note, is that, it is sharing the same base as a Geed's Fortune. So if you have a lot of experience finding Geed's Fortunes, you might know how rare they are. And you also know that once you have a strong build, they're typically not very rare. You can typically find them fairly often. Of course, remember though, they don't even drop for minions or regular monsters in Terror Zones. So it might be a little harder to find them than Geeds because it's even more restricted. This could change though, and I don't know whether it should change because I also don't know how rare the charm is in general. I don't think they should make it too rare to the point to where you're going to find Infinity first, but definitely want to make sure that it's like a middle. I think this is like a great mid-game buffer, so you don't feel like you're just in this empty space where your character is garbage forever until you get Infinity. But like also not super easy to the point to where the game becomes a joke really early in the game. So I think I don't think that would be the problem. I'm more concerned maybe they'll be too difficult to acquire. I would say that it's very unlikely they'll be too easy like this, especially certain ones that are in high demand. Bad RNG and whatnot, I could see it being pretty problematic. Alright. So let's talk about, now that we talked about how they work, that is how they work, basically. There might be some things I forgot, but in general, that is how they work. Completely. Alright, so let's talk about what they change. Okay, so we gotta talk about what they change and what they don't change. And let's just start with the easy stuff. So basically, this is what they intended. They make solo farming otherwise impossible or difficult Terror Zones for a build. Let's think like Cold Sork in the Glacial Trail. I mean, that's that's as hopeless as it gets, at least classically speaking. There's more cold immunes in there than you can count um, on one hand. So let's say that, you go in there and it's like, well, I can't kill anything. I'm stuck with this terror zone for an hour or whatever it is, and I can't kill anything. Well, that kind of sucks. Maybe I'll just go farm something else. But I really want levels, and my build is like level 97, and I just feel like I just can't get experience for an hour. So this is Blizzard's solution to that. Because now they make solo farming otherwise. It makes it possible if you have both this charm and a sources of negative res. Because remember, 95 resistance is still really difficult to deal with. You're not going to do any damage to a monster at 95 resistance, so you need other negative resistance on your gear. You need facets, you need things like Flickering Flame, Phoenix, that kind of stuff. Griffin's Eye, Crescent Moon, Thunderstrokes, or like lightning ones. Yeah, you guys, I think, get the idea. Alright, and of course, Cold Mastery, which is the only skill in the game that gives you negative enemy res. A ton of it, in fact. Maybe too much, but that is debatable. And so, all of those things make it possible for you to farm these otherwise impossible areas, and that if you just want to keep pushing to 99 using these terror zones, which I would think is the primary benefit of the terror zones, is going to 99. Because they give you way more experience than any other strategy in the game once you get to a certain level, like around level 93, 94. They're going to beat out the classic Bale running and Chaos running and whatnot pretty soundly by that point. If you want to be able to do that, you can even do it solo. That's the idea. Now, you could also do it before in a group. You just have the other people kill or help you out or carry you in the terror zones that you can't deal with, and then you carry them in the terror zones that they can't deal with. That would have been the approach before. But now you could even do it completely solo. No help. You can solo level to 99 and just push these with the charm, the Sunder Charm, and this negative res gear. And when it comes to cold and fire builds, they get a lot more benefit than maybe some other builds do because their immunities historically have been the most oppressive. Even in the late game, you can't break hardly any cold immunes with Infinity, for instance, which is crazy. And you can't break probably half of the fire immunes either. Whereas lightning builds and poison immunities, or lightning immunities and poison immunities, you could break most of them. Even though that wouldn't help you much with poison, it would definitely help you with the lightning ones. And so lightning builds almost always had an advantage when it came to grinding 99, especially considering that the major areas to get to 99 Chaos and Bale, lots of fire immunity. Lots of fire immunity in those areas. And even a lot of cold immunity as well. And so there's actually, strangely enough, there's actually the least amount of lightning immunity in those areas too. So when you think about it, like, there are, even though you could break the lightning immunities most easily, there weren't even lightning immunes to begin with for the most part, except for like maybe burning souls in the throne room. And that's pretty much it. Stormcasters, which are the weakest monster in Chaos. I mean, that's same thing with Burning Souls. They have like no HP. So, zero HP, meaning that, well, it don't matter. It don't matter. The lightning builds were almost always the clear choice for going to 99. The lightning builds, the physical builds in many cases, and the magic builds. And if you were any other type of build, I don't know, you had to like farm pit or something in players 8 while everyone else is farming the higher, richer experience areas. So that's a pretty big deal. This particular, so It also gives lightning and poison builds, though, some more power in the end game as well, because now they can have more of their negative enemy res apply to the immune monsters, because once again, the charm takes effect first. It just removes the immunity, and everything else, full force of infinity, negative 85 applies. Um, yeah, 100%. So, and it also allows for, more early game potential as well for like lightning builds, because if all you have is like a crescent moon, which is negative 35% lightning res, and then you have this charm, that means there's no monster in the game that's going to have more than 60 lightning res. That's pretty good, even if you don't have a great build. So, lots of options here. Alright, so what else does it change? Alright, these charms open up more options for Ubers, particularly for elemental caster builds, particularly like cold, fire, and lightning builds. Now, historically, physical builds have always had a huge advantage in Diablo 2 when it comes to Ubers, not the least because of stats like open wounds and crushing blow are much easier applied by a physical build rather than by a mercenary or something similar to make up for the lack of that on an elemental build. But also just because, like, yeah, crushing blow would just chunk them super hard. Um, they can't recover from it. It was consistent high damage output. And these Ubers have immunities. So you've got Uber Mephisto with lightning immunity. You have the other Ubers of fire immunity. You have other Ubers of like cold immunity. And this is just how it works. Most notable one, of course, is Uber Mephisto with lightning immunity, which is why even though lightning builds could usually fairly easily kill the other bosses with the negative enemy res, like with Infinity, they'd always have problems with Mephisto. Of course, Plague with its really high level lower resist proc can break that, so that kind of changed that in patch 2.4. However, now you don't even need anything that fancy. You can just slap on this charm, and voila. None of the Ubers are immune to you anymore, and so as long as you have a lot of negative res, you can kill the Ubers pretty fast, even on elemental builds. You could say, of course, this makes the physical builds a little bit less special when it comes to, killing the bosses, especially when physical builds typically never were advantaged in terms of like magic finding capability. So that's kind of like where the physical builds actually got to shine a bit. Now the elemental builds can do it all. There's nothing they can't do potentially. So this is definitely a major impact of this change. This is something you can debate whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. However, if the goal is build diversity, it is accomplished here because now there aren't just like Smiter and then Frenzy and Fury and Zeal. There's more stuff that can kill the Ubers now. Or like really high end double dream builds. No, see, you don't need as much anymore. All you need is negative enemy res, and you need this charm, and you can even still use a lower resist wand on top of Infinity, and you can do absurd amounts of damage with things like Meteor probably now. I'd say Meteor, Firewall, Blizzard should be able to kill the Ubers with negative 100. Cold resistance now against all Uber bosses. Yeah, why not? I mean, why not? I don't see why that can't happen. I mean, you can also throw static field into the mix too, so it's like crazy damage on those sorceresses, crazy damage. We might see some very easy sorceress Ubers with this. I can almost assure you of that. All right. There is one drawback, of course. That remember these charms have debuffs, and it's like negative resistance typically, to that element. So Uber Mephisto already reduces your lightning res by 125. And if you don't have maximum light res or beyond even, you need stacked light res, maximum light res from like T-Gods and Sorb, he'll one-shot you. So, keep that in mind. That extra negative 75 light res that is currently on the Crack of the Heavens Sunder Charm, which is the lightning one. You're going to need a lot of lightning res to deal with that. So there are some drawbacks to this. These Ubers do a lot of elemental damage, so might want to watch that. However, historically, casters have killed Ubers using an item called Marowak, which is boots that have bone prison charges, so you can root them in place and just start throwing blizzards or meteors on top of them, or killing them with lightning abilities, or you can just like telestomp them with lightning abilities. But that's just how it is. You don't want to do that to Bale though. That's Bale will be very bad. At any rate, these charms are going to make it more possible for those elemental builds to destroy Ubers. So now elemental builds will no longer have any content that they feel like is really, really hard, if not impossible, for most players. Alright. One thing that I don't know how people feel about this, because I don't know if most people prefer playing in a group or prefer playing solo in Diablo 2. I mean, I know there's a lot of people in my channel prefer playing solo. They like solo self-found and things like that, but that's because that's what I do for a lot of my content. Not all of it, but pretty large amount, especially when there's no ladder reset going on. For ladder reset, it's different, but group play is possibly discouraged by these charms to some extent. Once you acquire these charms in the, in the mid game and whatnot, now you have a way to just kill everything. You don't need anyone else's help. You can kill everything. As long as you have the negative res gear, you're good. Ordinarily, though, in order to achieve this level of power where you don't need anyone anymore, you'd ordinarily probably need like a lightning build or a magic build or something similar. You would need infinity if you're a lightning build, and you'd really need some endgame gear to get to that point. Now you could argue that that threshold is achieved a lot earlier, which begs the question, why not just try to solo farm these terror zones if you can by joining other games, getting the player count up, or just honestly buying lots of loaders, loading them onto a computer, and then stacking the game for player count, and then just farming the area yourself, because no area will actually prevent you from farming it. So I don't know what to exactly think of this necessarily, but this is a little maybe bit of a downside, but it is something that it changes. Now you don't need people's help with barring crazy endgame gear. Now you just maybe need a charm and some negative enemy res. So that does lower the threshold for achieving solo play, even in high player count or higher player count on Battle.net. Okay. So, infinity is less essential as a must-have. So, this is something that it does change. See, once again, kind of as I've been harping on earlier, you don't really need infinity anymore. You just need the charm. And this means that there are other ways in the mid game. There's a bridge between, having no ability to break any immunes and having garbage gear, and then acquiring the ability to absolutely destroy everything. There's actually something in the middle where you can now do damage as long as you have some source of negative enemy res. Could just be cold mastery and the charm, and you can kill things. You can kill almost everything, actually. Fairly easily, depending on the build, but for the most part, that is the case. So, but you're probably still not going to be destroying as much as if you had the charm and infinity, or just infinity in general, depending on if you're farming areas with no immunities. So that is something to consider, but it definitely makes infinity less as a must-have, which I think a lot of people would say is a very good thing, because like I said, there's never been much of a bridge there. Not much of a bridge there at all. So, yeah, that's how it is. Alright, as we continue to talk these Sunder Charms, as this TED Talk continues, um, it's pretty much how long this is, honestly. It's a TED Talk on Sunder Charms in Diablo 2. Biggest change in 20 years. With your host, Dark Humility. Alright, anyway. Rare items with tri-res. So this point is just about how resistance items are going to be seen as much more necessary or valuable to pair with these charms, especially when you're trying to achieve ultimate power in the endgame. So that means that you might see more uses of Chains of Honor, which I have historically thought of as mostly a waste because you can always get enough res on your charms. With a charm like this, though, it might be difficult on some builds to get enough res, which calls into question maybe some of your build choices, which maybe have less MF and other things like that. So, like, on a fire build, Flickering Flame would just take care of it for you with its resist fire aura, which would literally just negate the debuff, the negative 75 fire res from the fire charm completely. Sandstorm Trex would almost do that as well for the Rotting Fissure charm. So things to kind of think about, and then just items with res in general, even rare items might be seen as more valuable, like circlets, gloves, belts, and boots that have more res because you need more res in order to achieve that maximum power without constantly dying. And on hardcore, that's even more important because you can't even die at all. Which is why I think, honestly, like, this is a great time to play hardcore because if you're feeling like this change is cheapening the game, if you're one of those die-hard OGs that's like, man, they're just ruining the game, they're changing too much, they're making it too easy, well, I got a challenge for you. It's called hardcore. Let me tell you, they have a bad risk associated with them. There's a lot of res you're going to need. If you're concerned about these charms getting out of hand, hardcore is definitely going to make you rethink all of your itemizations, and these charms, of course, will just further add to that anxiety and that need to build defensively. So if you want something that's going to make you seek some higher challenge, do that for sure. I'm not saying that, getting 75 more lightning res on your build to tank souls is necessarily the epitome of challenge, but it will force you to play in a very different manner, and you can't just, pedal to the metal, play a all damage build and just destroy everything. You might have to play something that's significantly weaker in order to get that power in general. So you might not be able to get all of that power in every way you want it. So you have to think very carefully. And see, itemization choices, in my opinion, on hardcore are always more interesting, except for, the fact that, like, Storm Shield is used on 90% of hardcore builds. But let's continue, though. So these charms seem to have the most positive impact on builds in this order. So this is one of my more important observations, I would say. All right. This is how I would tier the Sunder Charms. The cold charms are most impactful on the cold builds. The fire charms are second. So the fire and cold builds are reaping huge rewards here. Lightning is also reaping huge rewards here. Those three are reaping most of the rewards, I would say. Period. Poison will reap some rewards, physical selectively, and magic will reap them not at all, at least with the current iteration of the charm. They're literally useless, which we will explain fairly soon, but yeah, they're actually useless. So cold builds, a lot of cold builds, the biggest issue is that there's just so many immunes that even with Infinity you can't break, and the fact that those immunes are the most oppressive, combined with the fact that a lot of these cold builds are on the Sorceress, which has Cold Mastery, which is built in negative enemy res in a skill. Tons of it. enough to get monsters to negative 100 with a decent amount of plus skills and nothing more is pretty crazy. So cold builds can just take every monster in the game to the cleaners with the cold charm. And or if they don't and they're not a cold sorceress, at the very least they're removing the biggest barrier to feeling like there's not much you can do with the build. Like let's say like freezing arrow, there's just so many cold immunes everywhere and it can be so annoying to play around them. It can hybridize a little bit, but it always felt challenging to deal damage, especially in higher player counts, and now that's not the case. So yeah, that is definitely something crazy to think. And of course, with lightning, the immunities were the easiest to break. Fire is a medium tier immunities to break, but fire does so much damage that once you get past the immunities, fire is just crazy. And of course, lightning, even though those were the easiest to break, now they're broken by the charm, which means that with infinity and griffins and T-strokes and titans and all that, not titans, sorry, crescent moon and all the other fun stuff, you can get monster resistances so low that used to be immune that it's almost as if the monster was never immune to begin with. And since lightning does so much damage on the high end, that basically makes lightning in the end game almost feel like magic damage to some extent, which is interesting. Physical, there's builds that can apply amplify or decrepify or grimward and get a lot of benefit out of it, especially from range. But the debuff, which is a huge amount of damage reduction, negative damage reduction, kind of like amplified damage, a fourth of its effect, just from the charm. It's kind of nasty stuff. Otherwise, it's not terrible, but there's also not many physical immunes. It's not many magic immunes. Poison immunes just doesn't seem to have much of an impact because even if you can set a poison immune to 95, not a lot of ways to reduce it that much further, so it can be difficult. We'll talk more about this, though, in a little bit, but I just want to show you guys kind of how I tier these charms and how I think most other people probably tier them that have done significant testing. All right. So the Cold Rupture GC has a positive impact on every underused cold build in the game, including Freezing Arrow, Hurricane Damage Focused Wind Druid, and then, of course, even the underused Cold Sorceress builds with Cold Mastery. Frost Nova feels really strong when you have gear now. You gotta have gear in the charm, but if you have the charm and you have gear, Frost Nova is shredding, as it probably should when you have gear and you can kill everything. It's actually incredible stuff. And everything's negative 100 res, so in a lot of ways it's actually doing more damage than Nova would, unless you're wearing Infinity with Nova. And it's actually competing with Nova to some extent. Not completely. Nova is still stronger, but it's competing with it to some extent. And then, of course, you have Frozen Orb, which still feels kind of weak because of lack of damage, but it feels like you're just able to kill things with it now, so it actually feels more impactful. You're able to kill a lot more areas, right? You're able to kill monsters that normally you can't. So they don't feel overwhelming, though. None of these other cold builds, they don't feel overwhelming with this change. They actually feel like, wow, I actually might want to play a cold build that's not Blizzard. So that's a really good thing, and that's a great change that these charms make. However, Blizzard is the exception, and I'm sure anyone that has done any amount of testing or theorizing knows just how ridiculous this can get. So let's put this into perspective. All right, so basically, the problem with Blizzard is it just does too much damage. All these other cold skills do cold damage to some decent extent, but Blizzard does so much damage It has such enormous damage output. Um, on top of possibly frozen orb, and on top of like ice blast, that with every monster's resistance negative 100, it just decimates everything. Even in players 8, once you get a decent amount of gear, even with something like 8 to 9k blizzard damage, which isn't even close to the cap, which is like 15,000. And it's, well, I think you can get higher than that actually, like 17,000, 18,000, but it doesn't matter because when it comes down to it, yeah, it's just crazy stuff. It's just crazy, crazy stuff. And with Infinity, you can even get more damage out of it just simply by putting 1 point into Cold Mastery. Now, with Cold Mastery, you don't even need Infinity, but if you do use Infinity, you can actually get more damage simply by putting only 1 point into Cold Mastery, putting the rest of the points into the Ice Blast synergies or the Blizzard synergies like Ice Bolt. And so you just get more points into it, and it's just nuts. Even from an early level, no gear, just need like a few extra plus skills, and monsters have almost no cold res until they have 0, and the damage is just nutty. So, yeah, this is. I don't really know how you solve this necessarily, but it is something where it's like, well, maybe they need to nerf the Blizzard skill itself, because you don't want to just nuke Cold Mastery, because then Frost Nova and Frozen Orb are left out in the cold again. Literally speaking, left out in the cold because they're cold skills. Get it? Left out in the cold. All right, never mind. That's bullshit. All right. Well, it's not. All right. All right. All right. All right. My jokes are bad. Okay. Anyway, you don't want them to be left out in the cold. So, how can you nerf Cold Mastery? You can't. And also, they haven't nerfed anything since D2R has come out. Since the game has come out, their approach has never been to nerf anything. So, what does this tell me? That even if the right approach maybe is to nerf Blizzard itself, the skill, like the actual damage output, they probably won't. So, what you're going to see is all the other cold skills feel a lot better and feel a lot more viable, but Blizzard is still going to be taking over as a highly dominant skill. And anyone that knows anything about metas is that if there's a very strong skill, or just very strong skills in general, it doesn't matter if you have other skills that are doable and feel decent. Those skills will still usually reduce build diversity just by via of being so strong and so effective. That is a danger here coming ladder 2. Like I said, they could address this in a couple of ways. You can't really nerf the Charm War itself as well, because once again, that's just going to hurt every other cold build. So, I don't know. I mean, my solution would literally just be to reduce Blizzard synergy damage across the board, and just make it to where it does not like so much less damage that it does nothing, but it just does less damage. And I think that's fine, because in PvP, it one-shots, like, it could kill someone 3 times over if you just get hit by 1 shards for most PvP characters, unless you're like a high ultra stacked cold resistance barbarian or something. So it wouldn't even hurt PvP if they did that, in my opinion. But, who knows what they're actually going to do, because I do know they also want to consider PvP, but yeah, Blizzard's ridiculous. Okay, and it always has been. It's always been one of the strongest skills, the strongest starting skills. If there is any time to nerf a skill, it is now. You don't normally want to nerf. I hate nerfing things. I think nerfing is the wrong approach almost always. Almost always you want to buff everything else to where it comes to that level. The problem is some skills mechanically can't come to that level no matter how much damage you give them. So that's where the nerf bat becomes mildly useful. So, however, anyone that just wants to hit it up with the cold sword, man. You're gonna have a great time if they leave it how it is. So I'm sure some of you guys are crossing your fingers. Please don't nerf it. Please don't nerf it. I want to smash the game with the Blizzard Sorcerers. It'll be good. It'll be good times. Good times. Um, it's arguable it already was smashing the game because almost all of the highest or the best farming areas were most easily accessible to the Blizzard Sorcerers anyway. And now every best farming area is accessible to the Blizzard Sorcerers, even the pit. So that's just how it is. That's just how it is, baby. Fire and the pit, by the way, has lots of cold immunes. So, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. All right, fire and I tested that. It literally doesn't matter. Fire and lightning builds benefit immensely from their respective Sunder Charms in both the mid and late game, with some other sources of negative res. These builds increase in power, with Infinity bringing its full might even against immunities. So, the thing about what this is going to do is it's going to make all fire and lightning builds way stronger, especially fire builds that lacked versatility because they are just gated by these fire immunes that they either couldn't break or didn't do much damage to because they didn't have a lot of negative res. Well, now they do, because once you get it to 95 and you have Infinity, they have 10 fire res. If you use like Phoenix on top of that, it's negative 18 fire res. The monster floor for resistance is negative 100, which is why I was mentioning that with Cold Mastery. With Cold Mastery, you can just get 195 Cold Mastery and it's over. And of course, you can continue going down from there. You know, Flickering Flame, negative 28. You can wear another Phoenix, and you can get like almost negative 100 fire immunes. So, yeah, pretty crazy stuff. And with lightning, you practically can get negative 100 lightning immunes. Negative 100 lightning resistance monsters that were previously immune. Remember, this only applies to immunities because the damage would apply to monsters that didn't have resistance to begin with. If a monster has 0 lightning res to start with, all it takes is Infinity and a crappy Griffins, and GG, they're already at negative 100. But when we're talking about immunes, you can still get them to almost negative 100 or to negative 100 just by leveraging all of this negative enemy res gear or facet gear or whatever on top of the charm. And so you can treat these monsters, these immune monsters, where before, even if you broke their immunity, they'd still be decently hard to kill. Now they're not. Now the full force of your negative enemy res is taking effect, and you are smashing them. This means builds like Lightning Fury, Lightning Nova, Fireball, Fissure. Really hard hitting builds are going to hit everything really hard once they are able to bring that full power to fruition in the mid and late game. And then poison and physical damage builds selectively benefit from their respective charms. So this is another thing that does change. So a source of lower resist, like from a Poison Nova Necromancer for poison, will definitely make it do something against those poison immunes. It means they'll take damage from the Poison Nova, and while they're draining, you pop one body with your Mercenary and Amp, and then you corpse explode them, and then usually they'll die faster or in fewer corpse explosions because every monster will be a little lower. That being said, though, that a monster that still has a decent amount of poison resistance, though, is still going to be fairly hard to kill with poison damage. And there's not as many ways to reduce poison resistance. There are items that can, like Grief and Death's Web, mainly weapons, facets, things of that nature. Definitely use of facets is very, very important. And then, of course, you have lower resist, which is your single way to break poison immunity, and at least historically without the charm. and that does apply a lot of negative enemy poison res. But it is harder to get negative enemy poison res in general on a standard build than it is on a fire or a lightning build, or a cold build, especially in the case of cold mastery. But even without it, things like ice and Wizened Draw are much more ready options and things that might be a little easier to get than, let's say, Death's Web. So, poison is looking okay. And then, of course, negative physical res with Amplify Damage, Decrepify, and Grimward make these charms helpful, but not necessarily groundbreaking for these builds. So, once again, not as many sources of negative enemy res on physical. As a matter of fact, there's no physical facets or rainbow facets, so you really are just limited to Amplify, Decrepify, and Grimward. If your build does not have these, you're not going to get any benefit at all. Another thing to note about physical is there aren't many physical immunes in the game, and in most areas that you would want to farm on a starter, even a mid-game physical build, there are practically very few physical immunes, and if there are any, they're random, so they don't always even happen, so it's very sporadic. And for the ability to break those physical immunes on a physical build, you incur one of the most harsh penalties, which, unlike lightning res or other res that can be easily made up, it's damage reduction. You lose 25% damage reduction on a build that fights in close quarters. That makes you take a lot more damage. That's 1/4 of the impact of Amplify damage, for some reference. And Amplify damage, as anyone that knows has played this game, makes you take so much more damage. So having even 1/4 of that is deadly, especially on top of Amplify damage. So I would say that Fire, Cold, and Lightning is being helped more by these charms. And this puts some poison builds, not Poison Nova Necromancer, because Poison Nova Necromancer is just ultra strong, even without considering immunities, really. Because it has 3 sources of damage. And many physical builds even further behind the other elements. So if you think about it, because the other elements are gaining more impact from these charms, those other caster builds mainly are leaving the physical builds further behind in terms of the overall power gap. People like to talk about all kinds of gaps. One example is like a wealth gap. Okay, well, you get the idea. So even not all of those gaps are important. Let's make it perfectly clear. Not all of them mean anything significant. Not all of them actually get at the heart of the problem or the heart of what is actually going on. In terms of maybe people making just natural choices of their own volition. But when it comes to this game, Diablo 2, power gap increasing is bad for build diversity. 100%. It will make it to where people see physical builds and now they see, well, now it's not unique in that it can only do Ubers and the elemental builds can't. And it's even weaker comparatively in areas like Terror Zones. Especially considering the attack rating penalty, that a high character level difference with a very high level Terror Zone that is spawned by a high level character can really make. You can't hit those monsters if the monster difference is too high, no matter how much attack rating you have. And a lot of those physical builds are going to suffer in multiple ways from this combination of charms putting them further behind and the terror zones making it more difficult to even engage them. So unless some of these other mechanics are addressed or the physical charms are adjusted, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, there seems to be a little bit of an issue here. So I love this change overall because I think it really does provide a lot more opportunity for a lot more builds. However, I do see it as a little rough around the edges, and there's definitely some issues, and you can kind of see some of them cropping up in some of this discussion of what they changed. Alright, and then, of course, the last issue that crops up, the one thing that does change is that one thing that a lot of people have noted is that hybrid and tribrid builds aren't as needed in the mid game, late game, as these charms provide simply more raw damage to pure builds. It's that simple. Also, if you try to use 2 of these charms in a hybrid build, you are taking more of those negative res penalties, making it difficult to survive while dealing damage and magic finding and putting on magic find gear and things of that nature, or even damage. Hybrid builds don't have as much damage because you have to split your damage typically between two trees, which means that itemization wise, you can't only go cold skills like for skillers and things of that nature. And it's just gonna lower your damage no matter what. Even if you do something like 3-piece towels on a sorceress, it's still gonna reduce your damage. And I mean, a choice like that anyway will already do that because it's geared toward magic find, but you get the idea. Like, these builds have a lot less damage. A pure build can get way more damage on that single element. Single element builds always suffered from the fact that they couldn't kill everything, and there was immunities that they literally couldn't break, even with infinity in a lot of cases. But now, no matter what the immunity is, any immunity in the game, no matter how immune it is broken by this charm, which means that a pure build that has negative res on top of that can kill anything. And so as long as it gets enough damage, it kind of in some ways negates the need for hybrid builds in lots of situations. However, I will talk about the flip side to this. There are still advantages that hybrid builds have, but they're not quite as pronounced as maybe they were once. And this is definitely, these charms are definitely in some ways enforcing pure builds to some extent on the game, which is unfortunately a side effect of many changes in other Diablo 2 mods that are not Diablo 2 Resurrected, which is the official release. Hybrid builds often get squashed by changes that really try to kind of like pour all of the damage or all of the power into like one element in general. And there's a very huge temptation to do that in Diablo 2 to solve the immunity problem. But anytime you address that, or you even make a step towards solving the immunity problem, now some of the more interesting builds or some of the more interesting playstyles or nuanced playstyles may simply just get left behind. And so that's not really unique to D2R in this particular solution at all. As a matter of fact, my favorite mod project, Diablo 2, I would say definitely suffers from this. Of course, there it's mostly an artifact of making areas that are too hard for hybrid builds to kill. And then, of course, creating more synergies for each, or for more synergies for more skills, making it tougher to hybridize and still gain sufficient damage. That has, now you have less damage for even higher HP monsters and maps, which really just makes it impossible to hybridize. And this situation still is possible to hybridize, so D2R hasn't quashed hybridization, but it's threatening it. And so that is something to note here. Alright, so, however, those are all the things it does change. So you might think, oh my god, that's a lot of change. That's a lot of change. Let's talk about also what it doesn't change and where some of these charms are lacking effectiveness or where they're just not doing something that people might think that they're doing. And we also don't want to overstate the change, you know, even though it's a big change. Is it everything? Is it nothing? Maybe it's somewhere in between. And so, you know, it's always good for clickbait, especially, you know, or just for in general, you know, it's always great to engage in hyperbole. You know, it's always great to be like, oh my god, the whole game is transformed. But we do have to temper our expectations. We have to remember other things about the game as well. And so that's kind of what this section is about in general. Let's get into it. We're about an hour into the video. If you're still with us, awesome. You clearly are a aficionado of video game TED Talks, as much as they exist. All right. The Black Cleft Sunder Charm is practically useless for magic builds. All right, so this is a charm that does nothing. It literally currently, in its current iteration, does nothing. And I mean nothing. So, you might think, no, Dark's ability, it has to do something. They created the charm to help the magic builds. It's geared for the magic damage. How could it do nothing? Okay, well, let's explain how this works. So, it does nothing. You could say that it can help you kill wave 2, bail wave platers 1 a little faster, but that's pretty much as you're ever going to get out of this charm. And that's really stretching it because it still practically does nothing. So, 95% resistance, remember this number, across the board. That also includes magic resistance. However, magic damage, which is things like Bone Spear, Holy Bolt, hammers, that stuff. If a monster has any resistance to that damage, you can't mitigate it by any means. You're just going to do less damage to those types of monsters, period. If it still has 95 resistance, you're only doing 5% of your magic damage. Infinity only reduces fire, cold, and lightning damage. It doesn't even reduce poison damage. Infinity can be used on like a Poison Nova Necro because part of Corpse Explosion's damage is fire damage, not because it does poison damage. Physical damage can of course be reduced by Amplify Damage, Curse, Decrepify, Curse, which can be on Reaper's Toll, Lacerator, things of that nature. Atmos Scarab. And then of course you have Grimward. Grimward can also do that. However, the problem here is that magic immunity and magic resistance, there's never been a way to break magic immunity because there's no way to reduce magic resistance, period. So if it's 95% still, that is still so high that even with 15k hammers, you're going to be doing hardly anything to even Platers 1 monsters that are magic immune, even broken by this charm. That is how useless these charms are. Just to paint for you a picture. And so, the penalty will not be incurred by a paladin in any form. So, in other words, the Hammered In and every other magic build will not want to use this charm in its current form. It will be totally worthless. The other thing that makes it worthless is that there's not enough magic immunes in the game to really encourage any magic damage builds to use it. There's Bail Wave 2, there's the one Terra Zone where there's magic immunes, or a couple of Terra Zones. You get the Ruined Temple in there with Kurost. You get the zombies in the Lost City. You don't even have Ancient Tunnels as a Terra Zone, which has the magic immune zombies as well. And then, you get them also sometimes in certain tombs, like, Tomb of Tal Rasha and in Worldstone Keep. But that's about it. Everywhere else, you'll never encounter them. And so, there aren't that many magic immunes in the game. You'd really have to have more magic immunes in the game for a hammer to be like, why would I use this charm that's going to debuff me when I can just skip these one pack of monsters or these couple packs of monsters I can't kill in the entire game, very rarely, when most of the time there'll be a Terror Zone where there's no magic immunes. So there's just not a lot of incentive. On top of that, the debuff on it is nasty. Negative 50% magic resistance. So not a lot of monsters do magic damage by the same token. But the ones that do are going to hit insanely hard, because there's also no way to increase your magic resistance. There are some items that provide magic sorb, like Spirit, like Oath, but those items are very few and far between. And they're very specialized, except for Spirit. And on Spirit, even with a little bit of Sorb, the magic damage is incredibly high. So you take all that extra damage from those snakes that shoot out bone spears, you're gonna get whomped. They already do a ton of damage. They already almost kill your hammered in without this debuff in one shot in some cases. You get enough bone spears layered on top of each other, shooting you all at once. Oh yeah, you're gonna die. And witches and guardians, they got some magic damage bullets as well. Oh my goodness. Damage, damage, damage. You're gonna take crazy damage from all kinds of very hard hitting attacks that already hit extremely hard. This charm is just not in a good situation. I'll recommend some possible changes, but it doesn't do anything. Magic builds just don't want to use the magic charm, and so if you find it, you may as well sell it to Geed if they leave it in its current form. It's better there. It's better in his gambling bar. All right. Another thing that to note is something I already touched on. Several physical damage builds may choose not to use the physical Sunder Charm, as its debuff is incredibly penalizing with not enough reward. So that 25% physical damage reduction that you lose, you just lose 25 DR. You go into the negative. You can go negative 125 with amplified damage on top of you. It's kind of nuts. A lot of ranged builds like Throw Barbarian and Strafe might find this charm very appealing, especially since they use Amplify damage, which is the most effective way to further reduce physical resistance. And they might also be more likely to farm areas where physical resistance on unique monsters might be slightly more common. However, if we are being completely brutally honest here, that stuff is painful, man. It's painful. It's just so painful. On a build like a Zealer or like a Whirlwind Barb, I mean, if you think you have hard time surviving even with pretty tanky gear already, with this charm, it's just not happening. I feel like the builds that need this the most, which are not the ranged physical builds, which tend to do decent already, are the ones that will be least able to use it because the debuff is so penalizing. And also, there aren't that many physical immunes in the game. Or it's not as bad of a situation as magic immunes. There's definitely a lot more. They're definitely a lot more common, especially with Stone Skin as a unique modifier that usually makes monsters physical immune. However, it's still kind of, it's still a little weak in that regard. But yeah, we'll talk more about how to address this later. But there's definitely physical builds that won't use them currently, and there's no magic build that will use these charms, just to keep, just to kind of keep this straight as we were going through this. All right, what else is not going to change? So something I've kind of harped on throughout this entire thing is that it's 95 resistance, so without negative enemy res, you're still not going to do anything. This means that even if you slap this charm onto your build, unless it is a cold mastery build, so cold sorceress is an exception, you are going to not be able to destroy the immunes. You might be able to barely damage them. Unless you have some other source of negative enemy res. And typically those items are a little more valuable. At least requiring a Vex rune for a Flickering Flame. Phoenix is insanely valuable. Very expensive. Vex Low Jaw. And then of course, Griffin's Eye, that's a pretty nasty one, right? I can kind of just name them off, but I think you get the idea. except for things like Crescent Moon and Thunderstrokes, most of these items are pretty valuable. So you're not going to just be going gangbusters against the immunities, even with the charm. So a lot of people, I think, they're very concerned that the game is becoming too easy and that the game is changing to the extent to where they're just trying to make it more like Diablo 3, which I hate Diablo 3, by the way. Um, I just think it's not very interesting. They just took everything that's interesting about an RPG, or everything that makes a game an RPG, or even just a Diablo game, and they just removed it from the game. It's you gotta really like it as a very different game and a very possibly unchallenging experience just in general. So I'm not a fan of Diablo 3. I've never streamed it. I don't plan on ever doing so. I will test Diablo 4, but I don't know. We'll see what happens with that. There's good and bad already creeping up on that one, so who knows what the final verdict is in the end. But what I can say is that this game isn't becoming Diablo 3. These charms seem like they might be moderately difficult to acquire, and even when you acquire them, you're still going to need some very powerful items to make them powerful to the extent like Infinity. Infinity's another one. I mean, that's the big one, right? That's the really big one. I didn't even mention that. 2 Burr runes. I mean, like, that's the stuff that's going to make these charms insane. And at the end of the day, that gear is very hard to acquire. And you were already insanely powerful on most of these builds, just in select areas if you were a fire or a cold build. And now you're just that powerful everywhere. It doesn't really change how powerful the build feels, it just changes how many things you can do with it. And so ultimately, like, this is not like it's not simplifying the game. It's just making it to where things you would never do ordinarily, you can now do. And so, this point here is that, like, early mid-game Magic Find builds can't even really use this charm in a lot of cases. Like I said, there are cases where they can, like with Cold Mastery, but for the most part, this isn't really the case. And so, yeah, it's not a free ride. It's definitely not a free ride. If the monster is 95 res, you're going to be doing nothing to the monster. I can promise you that. 100% tested. Just try to hammer a plague bearer zombie with that charm on. Yeah, have fun with that. I mean, you'll kill him eventually, but it takes at least 7 rotations and players 1. Very fun stuff. Okay, anyway. If not more. Alright, so this is the flip side of Infinity becoming less essential as a must-have, is that something that kind of doesn't change is that Infinity is already the dominant approach on fire, cold, and lightning builds, particularly fire and cold builds. I mean lightning builds, because you couldn't break the immunities, the cold immunities, with Infinity hardly ever. So it was kind of a hit or miss on cold builds. But now that you can break all these immunities with the charm, Infinity now is really the gateway to the end game for these builds. 100%. It's just the gateway to these builds. It is the gateway to these builds. So you get the full negative 85 enemy resistance will be applied to all monsters regardless of previous immunity status for cold, fire, and lightning. So Infinity is just crazy now. You almost would never want to use anything else in the endgame now on any fire, cold, or lightning build. And in some ways that reduces some mercenary itemization diversity, but it doesn't really. This is under what doesn't change. And that's because it really doesn't change. Infinity is still the GOAT for those builds. And it might, I would say, even more so now that it can do this. And even for the cold builds, even the ones with cold mastery, you can argue that just having to put only 1 point into cold mastery is very beneficial. saving like almost 20 points into Cold Mastery allows you to put those points into the other damage skills, which will make your build even stronger. So it's just really strong. It's really good stuff. It's really amazing stuff in general. And so I do think it's just it is the epitome of the end game now. It's not as essential in the mid game, and you don't feel like you're starving for something. But now in the end game, if you want that end game fantasy, if you want that full impact of the charm, you're definitely going to want to access Infinity. All right. Or, I mean, you can use a lower resist wand, of course, but it's just so much slower. It's kind of a joke. All right. All right, so given that these charms can only be found from certain monsters in Terror Zones and at least have the rarity of a Gade's Fortune, they are not simply given. They may be quite valuable, and while not as difficult to especially certain ones, like the cold one, I imagine will be quite valuable. I'm even thinking as high as maybe a low rune for one of these charms. An LO rune, not a low rune like an if. A low rune as in an LO rune. Which makes fortitude and grief. So yeah, I'm thinking some of these charms will be insanely valuable because so many people are going to be wanting them, especially in the beginning of ladder. And you only have 1 in 6, and then you can also get a Gade's Fortune. And what if it's not just 1 in 7 overall that you get one of these charms? What if these charms have even lower odds? I can't imagine it. It's very possible that these charms might end up costing a fourth of an infinity anyway. So that's still quite a bit of wealth for especially a lot of players starting out and that don't have a lot of time to play. They're not given. Removing these immunities is clearly not easy, and then reducing them to the point to where you're crushing the game is also not easy. The game Diablo 2 is still hard, folks. This is still a brilliant masterpiece of a classic game that requires grinding and effort and game knowledge, unlike most AAA titles in the modern era. Rest assured. Alright, so let's kind of move down from that. The rest of these points kind of harp on these points that I've already been making. So these charms only remove immunities and do not increase damage by themselves, while also coming with a nasty debuff. I like this risk-reward scenario. I think this is a good thing. I do. Because they are highly situational. On a lot of builds, let's take a Poison Nova Necromancer for instance. His best farming area is probably still the pit. Most Terror Zones are probably still not going to be able to compete with how fast he can farm items in the pit. Even with the higher treasure classes and the items that maybe couldn't drop in the area before being able to drop from regular monsters and getting the higher TCs more often. And the more experience, well, if you want the experiences, are always going to be good. But the pit doesn't have poison immunes. So this charm does nothing in there. It does nothing. In its strongest farm area. Think about the Stony Tomb. That area is still going to be amazing for fire builds. You don't need this charm in there. This charm doesn't take over the game. A lot of the strongest farming scenarios, it doesn't create a lot of new strongest farming scenarios. I'd actually argue it almost creates none, to be honest, when it comes to like efficiently farming an area with the build, because the best areas are always going to be the ones with like hardly any resistance to your damage type, no matter what. Any area that doesn't have fire immunes, like the Stony Tomb or Maggot Lair, is still going to get crushed. Or, all kinds of areas. Travancore is still going to get crushed by cold anyway. It already was getting crushed by cold, except for torque. You might use it for torque, but that's about it. You're going to have to watch out for that cold enchant, though, because if you don't have enough cold rays, you're going to die in one shot with that charm on. There are some serious drawbacks to these charms. They are situational. You do not use it on every build in every situation. If you're farming your most efficient farming zone on a build that, is strong in there because there's literally no resistance to your damage, and you don't even need specialized items. You can just go pure MF in these areas because you don't need negative enemy res. You don't need super expensive items to farm these optimal areas. These areas are still going to be optimal. Terra Zone just means that now there are areas that you can farm that can give you more experience. So the experience really is the big benefit. And then they are also viable now for farming other items, albeit maybe a little slower. So that's all these charms really truly accomplish at the end of the day. These are areas. These charms essentially allow a build to farm areas, not just terror zones, but any area in the game that the build would never farm otherwise. Let's make that absolutely clear. Never farm otherwise. Never farm otherwise. Even for the cold sorceress, Ancient Tunnels is still looking amazing. There's no natural cold immunes in there. Very rarely you get them at all in there. And of course, you can farm the pit now, but that just allows you another option that would never have existed. And it doesn't necessarily make it amazing or good. It can make it decent. If it's a terror zone and it's a good terror zone that's, good geography for the build, it's easily accessible by the build, whatever, yeah, it's going to be good with the charm, and now you can farm it with the charm, but those tried and true areas are not being, they're not being boxed out by this. And a lot of the times there's terror zones that are just going to suck. It doesn't matter if you can break the immunities or not. They're never going to be able to outcompete areas like the Pit, Travancore, Chaos on a tried and true build that already destroys them. Ancient Tunnels, Arcane Sanctuary for a Lightning Sorceress, Mephisto and Endariel that have the best drop chances for certain loot. Same thing with Travancore and Ghost type monsters. They drop certain loot like runes, charms, gems, and jewels at a much higher rate. Most of these terror zones are made terror zones to make them viable because the monster types in them are not the best for dropping most of the loot that people want, except for maybe Griffins or Death's Fathom because of the high treasure class. But those items are still so super rare, you're not even going to feel it in a lot of cases. So people that think that this is changing the game too much, all down. It's not changing as much as you think. It's not changing as much as you think. It is giving people more options. It's giving people more options for builds to get to 99 to begin with. There are now more ways to get to 99 than playing a lightning or a magic damage build in Chaos and Worldstone. That is amazing. There are also now more areas or terror zones you might want to farm for gear when they become available on all kinds of builds, even if they might have immunity problems, because there might be ways to deal with it, which are the Sunder Charms. So in general, I love the theme. I love the concept behind these changes. I do think the terror zones are maybe still a little rough around the edges, and when it comes to the Sunder Charms, there's definitely a lot of roughness here, and there's a lot of maybe missed opportunities if they don't clean it up a little bit, as I'll talk about a bit more down here. But that's pretty much all there is to it. Something to note is that these charms take up 3 inventory boxes, slots, whatever you want to call them. That's 21 Magic Fund. That's a skill GC, with life, potentially. That's, or faster hit recovery. That's a lot of stats you could be missing out on. That's damage. If you farm in your most efficient area, all you want is damage, especially if you're just going up and up and up in the player count. You don't, and if you've got other players to help you out, shit, like, why do you even need to break the immunes at all? Like, just have them help you break it with different damage types. Just get more damage. So, like, these charms are highly situational. Highly situational. There are still going to be areas that are always optimal, whether or not they are terror zones or not. And that's kind of what I've been talking about here. I do think these nasty debuff is very nice trade-off for hardcore. And I think overall this is just very good stuff. I really like this trade-off, and I don't think it is making the game too easy. And I think I've already hammered that with a few points, but let's continue hammering it. Why not? So I think you can really drill it in those people that really think, man, this game's going to shit. You know, of course, people love to be shitters on the internet. They love to troll, but we're going to tell them the truth, okay? We got to tell them the truth. We got to calm them down a bit. It's not as crazy as they think. These changes are not as crazy as they think. They actually are. Areas that are already strong for a build without the charm will probably still be strongest in many scenarios because you don't have to sacrifice gear or power to make up for that debuff, the negative res, especially on hardcore, or the fact that you need negative res on gear to even make the charm impactful, and also the fact that you're using a GC slot. It's true. You gotta sacrifice a lot to use these. There's a lot of build decisions that have to be built around these GCs. And that sacrifices a lot of other stats. And those other areas, even if they're not terror zones, those tend to be the tried and true areas. That's why they're either not terror zones or not terror zones all the time, because that's just how it is. Like there's a lot of terror zones that people never farm, and that's the whole point, is to get them to actually want to farm them, because they have to compete with the likes of the Pit and Chaos and Worldstone Keep, and how much density is in there, how many elite packs are in there, how accessible they are, how easy it is to kill the monsters in there for all kinds of different builds, whatever it is, how good the monsters are in terms of having optimal loot tables for certain loot types. All those things make a big difference. This is what terror zones are up against. And as good as the terror zones are, that's an uphill battle for a lot of those terror zones. And some of them maybe not. Some of those terror zones are always going to be good. It's like terror zone cows. Heck yeah, let's go. I don't care what build I am. Yeah, right? But there's a lot of them that's not the case. On Maxwell, we're going to have a terror zone tier list, so you can maybe more easily gauge whether or not it might be worth trying a terror zone, especially after you try it once. And then, maybe you just want to go back to what works for that build all the time. It just depends. But it's a nice breath of fresh air in case you don't want to just sit, not breathe, breathing nitrogenous air in the pit and suffocating with no oxygen because you're farming there 5,000 times. You don't have to do that. Okay? You can actually farm something else. All right, I don't know if that analogy really works, but anyway, I think you guys get the idea. All right, so it's probably the most ridiculous explanation ever, but that's all right. Anyway, you don't want to use these charms. Okay, so once again, we're just hammering these points. You really don't want to use these charms if there's no immunities or very few to your damage types or type. You don't want to use them. There's so many situations where you don't want to use them. And this is why this is a good change from Blizzard, because there are situations where you might want to use them now, especially if you're trying to get experience in terror zones or if you just want the freedom to farm them. But there are a lot of situations where you just don't want to use them. They just hurt you. That's it. It really is geared towards helping people with unoptimal terror zones for their build in general. Because if you find an optimal one, you also don't need it because they don't have immunes, once again. And the coolest thing about these charms is it allows you to clear chaos like on a fire sorceress. That is freaking awesome. But once again, it's situational. And if you don't have a lot of negative enemy res, and I mean a lot, not just flickering flame and the charm, you need like infinity as well. You're not going to be breaking the fire immunes and chaos to the extent that you're actually going to want to farm it. Trust me. I tried it with like negative 80 fire res. It's not enough. That's even what they give you to test with on the PTR, so it's pretty easy to test yourself. Only want to use them when immunities get in the way, and when you want to farm an area with lots or at least a couple of those immunes that are going to make it annoying. You really can't do that much without all that negative enemy res, like from Infinity, like I mentioned, or like from Phoenix, things like that. Infinity's insanely strong though. So like Infinity just if you really want the crazy power, you're gonna need Infinity more now than ever. If you just want to be able to farm the areas and get by, the charm will allow you to do that even without Infinity. But keep in mind that that's where it's still the end game power fantasy is still alive and real. They didn't nuke Infinity and make Burr runes worthless. Just calm down. Trust me. Nothing too crazy happened here. Alright, not like that anyway. Most of the strong builds that already have already been strong. Okay, so this is a very important point here. Okay, so this is a little bit different. So this is on a different note. Most of the strong builds that have already been strong are still the strongest builds in the game. If there's almost no better indicator of how, even though things have changed, the more things change, the more they stay the same to some extent. All right. What builds are still at the top? And you'll see this when we update our tier lists on Maxroll, or I release the tier list else out. But at any rate, it doesn't matter. Like, look. Okay. This is very important. Alright. Hammerden is still S tier. The Lightning Fury Amazon is a little bit stronger in the endgame, but she's still a beast. Lightning Sorceress, same thing. Nova Sorceress, still the same thing. Fire Sorceress actually has enough versatility now where you could actually argue that the Fire Sorceress is S tier. And you could also say the S tier power of the Blizzard Source now applies not just in some areas, but everywhere, even in the endgame. All of the strongest builds, all of them, are still powerful, except for maybe the Assassin, because currently the traps don't work with it. So you can argue the Assassin took a little bit of a hit here. Alright. Some builds that were already ultra strong but were maybe limited are now clearly S tier, but they already had that power to begin with, just in certain areas. And so they already have the mobility, they have the faster cast rate, they have the ability to stack magic fine. They move fast, they kill fast, they have the damage. They might have find item, like Berserk Barbarian is still one of the strongest builds in the game. If you want to target elites, there's nothing that's gonna find you items faster, even if it's in a terror zone. It doesn't matter. And of course, in the Berserk Barb, you still wouldn't use something like the Magic Charm, because you have concentration, which will kill them way faster than reducing magic resistance to 95. There's no magic build you would use that on whatsoever. Like I said, it just doesn't do anything. But anyway, that's really... And then, of course, the builds that still have the most AoE damage output, not just the damage and the ability to stack magic fine and the mobility, the core mechanics are still what define what makes the builds the strongest. And I think for a lot of people, some people might kind of despair at this, because they're like, well, now, what does this mean, Dark Humility? You're telling us that not a lot changed in regards to overall tier rankings, and that's basically what I'm telling you. some minor stratification going on, right? In a sense, the physical builds and the trap builds and the minion builds don't really benefit. A lot of them, maybe they get hurt a bit. And the magic builds didn't benefit. Maybe some of them drop a little bit. But overall, that's not the case. Or maybe the poison builds where it just doesn't do anything for a lot of them because there's not enough negative enemy res to really drop the poison res far enough. Not Poison Nova, because Poison Nova will still destroy anything, but because of Corpse Explosion and Poison Nova. But the thing is like, there's a lot of builds that might get hurt comparatively because the Fire, Lightning, and Cold builds are going this way at lightning speed. They're going up. They're going up, and the rest of the builds are like, they're going up like this, and the other builds are, it's small incline on the rest of the builds. And in the case of like the some of the physical builds, you can even argue like they're even going down a bit, And then of course the minion builds and the trap builds are just staying the same. They're just flatlining, so they comparatively they end up actually a little bit worse. So this is something to kind of despair about, because if you wanted more build diversity, you don't want the gap between the weaker builds and the strongest builds to increase. But it does appear like that's what this change might accomplish, unless they modify some of the charms, which we're going to talk about very soon here. But I know, I talk forever, but here's the truth. The truth is this: currently, not a lot of mobility going on in the overall meta when it comes to what builds are going to be the strongest, because the fundamentals still went out. Now, let's talk about a very specific hybridization scenario that I tested quite a bit. I tested some other ones as well. So remember how I said you can put 3 of different charms in the same inventory? So you can remove fire immunity, poison immunity, and physical if you want on a Poison Nova Necromancer, which means that theoretically there's no immunity to any of your damage sources. But not so fast. Remember, when you remove an immunity, all it does is reduce the immunity to 95% resistance, which means you're still doing jack all to the monster unless you have something that reduces it further. Well, interestingly enough, on a Poison Nova Necromancer, for the poison damage, it's pretty straightforward. If you're up against poison immunes, the poison charm will help the Poison Nova Necromancer a little bit, because now you can kill the poison immunes with lower resist stacked on top of it, and you'll be able to clear them faster once you can get that one body for Corpse Explosion. However, most of the time when you want to maximize your damage on a Corpse Explosion Necromancer, Corpse Explosion on any Necromancer, want to use Amplify Damage. Amplify Damage lowers the physical resistance. So, does that mean that the Fire Charm will be very effective, even though Corpse Explosion is half physical, half fire damage? No, because they'll still be 95% fire resistant. And you don't want to use lower res because it doesn't reduce as much resistance as Amp does. Amp is negative 100. Lower res is like up to about negative 67. So as you can see there's a problem. You don't want to use the Fire Charm despite doing fire damage, because even if you break the fire immune, you have no other means of reducing that resistance. Of course, you can argue that if you do have Conviction Aura, so if you have Infinity, you will reduce that damage. So Fire one is totally useless on this build, though. I should put with a caveat if you aren't using Infinity. So from my testing, though, it seemed like Poison was the most impactful against Poison immunes, because that's the biggest problem, is making sure you can get that first body. And if you can't reduce the health of all the monsters around you with the Poison, it's kind of hard to kill them. It just takes a lot longer. However, it is true that if you use the fire res charm and you have infinity, it will make Corpse Explosion do more damage against the fire immune monsters. If you're using amplified damage against the physical immunes, it will make Corpse Explosion do a lot more damage. And so if that is the case, you can get even more damage out of Corpse Explosion in addition to poison. This also would apply to a summoner, not to the summons because they're a minion, but to the Corpse Explosion itself. And so you could stack them all on the same build. I do question if it's worth all those debuffs though. And so that's why I kind of conclude that it's not quite as impactful as you might think. It can help, especially in areas like Chaos Sanctuary. But like I said, the physical Sunder Charm will allow you to get the full effect of amplified damage, even if you're not using Infinity on an already expensive build. But it will work. And that being said, though, do you really want to take on all those negative stats, especially negative damage reduction? 25%? I don't know. That build's kind of fragile sometimes anyway, so you really have to consider if you can even get the resistance for the other two as well. It's just, oh man, it can be a nightmare. I don't know. I think against maybe monsters with high enough HP, like maybe Venom Lords and things in Chaos, like as long as you have Infinity, you have to have some negative fire res somewhere. It might do something. And in some rare scenarios with the physical immunes, it might also do something. But it definitely leaves the option open. And so that is kind of cool that you can do that. I kind of like that they allowed that. But at the same time, it doesn't really change overall how strong this build is because it already has 3 damage types to begin with. So it's not going to massively change how that build operates. And that goes for a lot of hybrid builds in general. On to our next point. Hybrid builds have the advantage of not needing these charms, and thus can stack more magic fun, thus cementing a role for hybrid builds still in general, even in the late game. So as long as you can still 1 or 2 shot the monsters with your hybrid build, no matter which skill you're using, whether it's like Nova or Fireball or Blizzard or whatever, the hybrid builds still have an advantage because you don't have to incur that debuff from the charm. You don't have to use the charm and take up the charm slot. You can just kill the monsters that are immune with the other element. And so that also means that these types of builds are also more effective before you even acquire the charm, which is maybe more of a mid-game thing to begin with. Even in the late game, though, builds that use this charm are not going to be able to stack as much magic find. You might say it's not a huge amount, but it's, even a few percentage points can make a pretty big difference. And especially if you're still one-shotting the monsters anyway, and you don't need the excess damage for like players one farming of the pure builds, hybrid builds still have a role. So this is something where, I kind of was like, hybrid builds, no one needs them anymore. I mean, there is an element of that to some extent. I kind of gave the counter argument, but this is the other argument, which is that hybrid builds still have a very solid role in the game. And that is why. Alright, so we've gone over what they don't change to some extent, what they do change to some extent. This is kind of something that can belong in both, honestly. I mean, it allows you to hybridize or tribridize the charms and to maybe get the most out of all elements of those 3 element builds, but it also doesn't really do as much as you might think, and it's not as good as you might think as well, because for the most part, you're not facing the physical or the fire immunes. Those aren't usually what's going to slow you down. It's usually the poison immunes anyway. But at any rate, it's not always the case. So there's a lot of things that change and don't change. And with a huge list of things that don't change, I think, or at least arguments for why not as much is changing or not as much is fundamentally being completely revolutionized or overthrown, in a French Revolution style, in the game. It's not that crazy. There's a lot of continuity here. Not only is there a lot of continuity, um, but there is still, because of the rest of the fundamentals of the game, but there is also really just not. People, I think, are putting way too much weight on these changes as if they're going to completely change how the game is already played. They will definitely spice things up, especially the 99 grind. However, you might want to temper some of those thoughts because these types of things are a lot more situational than I think a lot of people are giving them credit for. Some people are thinking now people are only going to want to farm terror zones, or they're only going to want to use these charms. And that's just simply not the case. Or they're only going to want to farm all these areas that are not optimal for them originally, and that's not how it is. It's mostly a build mechanics thing. Immunities have always played a role, but more so as a gatekeeper to whether or not you can farm an area. And as long as the mechanics of the builds are unique, people will still want to play them because they'll offer different options for the terror zones and for all of the other areas that they can be strong in at different points in the game. So, that all being said, let's go over what I'd like to see polished or changed. So, there's quite a few things that I can observe here. So, the big one that needs to change before they're launched, I think, which is really, really bad currently, it really hurts summon builds. Not really summon necromancers because they have corpse explosion, but it hurts anything like summon druid, hydra sorceress, which is a trap technically of some kind, trap builds, which is like pretty much almost every single trapsin build. That is really bad that these immunities don't break for traps. So it doesn't apply to any of those traps or summons or hydras or pets or minions or mercenaries. And I think that's a bit of a mistake. Now, how would you fix that? You would just allow it to apply to those things specially, but currently the way the game is coded, there's certain skills that are classed as minions or pets and whatnot. So I don't think they can solve this easily. I do hope they can get out some kind of a solution, though, for it before Ladder 2. Otherwise, the Assassin class may be dead on arrival when it comes to Ladder 2. And I don't even think that is hyperbole. I think you might think Phoenix Strike might make up for it, but a lot of those skills aren't even affected by negative enemy res either, because of the shards and bolts that come out from those skills just aren't affected by them because of how they're coded. So even the martial skills, where you think there might be a silver lining, not necessarily. So Assassin being left behind, I don't know. I mean, in patch 2.4, they also got the least number of arguably helpful changes, especially to their most dire in need skills, which tells me that they either hate Assassin or they know about this issue, which is why they didn't put the Assassin up for testing, and they're working on a solution. So let's hope it's the second one. Yeah, I mean, if you make every other build much more stronger and effective with the charms, and you can't get around the immunities still on the Assassin, sure, you still have 3 damage types. So that's the nice thing. But, I mean, that's still going to hurt damage output from things like Lightning Sentry. I mean, it's still going to fire at lightning immunes and kill nothing, so... and you can't even control that to a large extent on that build because it's AI targeting, so... based on proximity and everything else. So it's not ideal. If the goal is build diversity, I'd say this has to be addressed because this is actually one of the things hurting build diversity the most with the current charm system. The Black Cleft Sunder Charm should reduce magic resistance of immune monsters to like around 75% instead of 95%. If a quarter of the damage could get through, this would be effective. Hammers and magic damage in general, which tends to be pretty high damage, will do damage to monsters if you can reduce the magic resistance to about 75. Or if you create an item that actually reduces it by some percentage, which currently no such item exists for magic damage. And this is the problem with that charm. But that's only the first thing you would have to do to this charm. That is how flawed it is. You would also have to maybe create more magic immune guest monsters in the game to soft nerf builds like the Hammerden, while also just giving more incentives for every magic damage build to actually use the charm. Because why use it if there's no magic immunes, which in the vast majority of scenarios, especially compared to every other immunity, there's just not many scenarios. So you'd have to increase the number of scenarios in order for people to use it as well. This is how flawed this charm is. It just doesn't do anything. Additionally, the debuff on it, 50%, is ridiculous. You can maybe tone it down to like 25% or something, and maybe it's a little more reasonable for magic damage at least. But that's still a lot. 50% is kind of nuts. I do think 25% though might be fine for a build as tanky as the Hammerden though, or a lot of other very tanky magic damage builds in general. Things like Berserk Barbarian that can get very, very tanky. And so it is like they need to change like 3 different things just to make this charm work, and that's literally what it would take to make this charm work. Something else they could do is they could have the charm itself lower magic resistance on all monsters. So like negative 15% magic resistance on all monsters. It only applies to monsters and not, players in PvP. They could do that. And then they would, essentially all monsters, which most monsters in this game have some form of magic resistance, would allow you to do more damage. The only problem with that is that the Hammerden already does crazy damage. So, probably not a good idea. So, yeah. I mean, once again, you could just nerf the damage numbers on Blessed Hammer. Kind of like with Blizzard, you could tone down some of these extra strong skills, and then you can focus more on maybe elevating skills like Bone Spear a bit, and then you'll get a bit more parity, and so you don't have to worry about whether or not the charm makes only one of those builds too powerful in the case of like Blizzard or Blessed Hammer. So, for instance, I think like negative magic resistance would be amazing for Bone Spear. Like that's exactly what Bone Spear would need. Would be something like magic resist reduction. 15% or something across the board. That would actually be crazy. Or 25% even. But the problem is that Hammerden is, everyone immediately thinks, well, that's just going to make that super broken. So, I don't know. At any rate, that charm is useless until a lot of things are accomplished. As a matter of fact, even if they introduce the magic immune guest monsters, and make it reduce the immunity to 75% instead of 95% for this particular immunity, is if they don't like tone down that debuff, it's just gonna get people killed in like one volley of bone spears from a pack of snakes. It's gonna be nasty. I don't know, man. There's so many issues with that particular charm. It's hard to know where to start. Bone Break Sunder Charm. The debuff is too harsh. We talked about this earlier. We talked about how painful it is. I would recommend, especially for builds that engage in close combat, which most of the physical builds do, because it's a physical build charm. So I'd recommend making it to maybe where it wipes out like a string of ears, but not where it almost wipes out a storm shield. I think that's probably a better place for it to be. And then you can stack enough damage reduction on the rest of your build pretty reasonably to get to a decent amount of damage reduction still, while not being invincible, because now you have a bit of a debuff here. And so, and the other thing is that damage reduction, kind of like with the magic resistance, which you can't mitigate by almost any means except, once again, like some minor sources of magic sword. Damage reduction is not a super common stat. Percent damage reduction on items, that is not a common stat. It's only on very select items, so unless you want very limited build diversity on physical builds, you probably can't put it this high. I think it's fine if they do something like 15 physical damage. I think the other problem is there's not many physical immunes in the game. So, kind of like with the magic one, it makes sense, especially for physical builds, because physical builds in general, I don't feel like do enough damage to some extent in the endgame, especially in higher player count. Why not give them like negative 15 physical resistance that only applies to monsters, not PvP? That would work even better for physical, because that wouldn't make a single physical build too strong, in my estimation. It'll make, some of the very strongest ones, like Zeal, fairly powerful for sure. But it's not going to make them absolutely, like, broken, because they're still limited by the fact that they have less AoE. In most cases, they teleport slower. There's just problems in general. This could also allow you to kill Uber bosses even faster, which would then still incentivize the creation of physical damage builds, because now they can compete with the elemental builds in terms of clear speed. The elemental builds, now that they can kill Ubers, dollars to donuts, they kill them a lot faster than the physical builds. And the reason is as long as they can get their massive amounts of damage, 50,000 damage, 30,000 damage in there, physical builds got nothing. As long as they can break the resistance enough, which they can now, with the charms against every Uber boss, that is going to be the case. So yeah, the same can be done to the poison charm to make that one more appealing as well, as the buff for that one is also arguably insufficient to achieve more parity. So yeah, so there aren't a lot of sources of negative poison resistance either. There are a bit more of negative physical resistance, but the truth is, there aren't a lot of physical immunes, whereas there are a lot of poison immunes. The main problem with poison is that it's just like you only have pretty much lower resist, even if you have that on your build, and then that's that. Especially if it's not a Poison Nova Necromancer. No, Poison Nova Necromancer has other sources fairly easily, but every other build, not so much. And this would be pretty big. Pretty big. I think just providing like something that only works against monsters, just a negative res to some of these builds, really can take advantage of maybe a missed opportunity if they don't do this, to buff underused poison builds, every physical build, which honestly all of them are underused, probably for good reason because of where the game currently is at. Don't penalize the physical builds even more than the elemental builds of the stat that's even harder to mitigate than elemental resistance, which you can just stack a couple of charms for. You can't get this stat on charms. It has to be on hard gear. I mean, this just penalizes them even harder than the elemental builds. Once again, further widening that gap. All they have to do really is just lower this penalty and possibly make some kind of global benefit, kind of like with magic damage, as long as you can nerf hammers. You create some kind of global benefit. You nerf some of the top end damage on hammers, maybe Blizzard, and then you can have some other fun stats for the other builds, I mean, heck, you could even on the cold one, you could even put this on the cold one as long as, because it won't affect the cold mastery builds at all. It'll just affect the other cold builds that aren't played as often. And so it's like, these stats are a great way to do that. Negative enemy res is a huge stat, and it can really make a big difference in terms of the build's ability to kill everything in general. And as long as there's still a penalty, a sizable penalty, I think negative 15% physical res is still a very sizable penalty, if you ask me. It's already forcing you to scramble around to get somewhere DR, so you don't just get gibbed by things. That combined with a better reward, I think makes a lot more sense to me. And I think, even the poison builds, which don't benefit too much because monsters still have so much poison res typically, even after you apply what limited sources of negative poison res you have available to you. They just need a bit more. It just needs a bit more. It's a great opportunity to do this. If they want to close the gap, or even close the gap more than it was closed by patch 2.4, this is what they need to do. I do think they've brought more builds into the S tier already, which is a good thing, but they've widened the gap between the worst builds and the best skill builds overall. There's a bit of a splitting going on to where there's almost like not that many builds in like the B and A tier area now, and there's like a lot of builds like clustering towards the end now, towards the F tier, and there's a lot of builds clustering towards the S tier. And so, not necessarily a good thing. If they want more build diversity, I mean, they'll get a little more build diversity because there's now a little more clustering going around the S tier. But now it means no one's going to touch any of the other builds that aren't anywhere around the S tier, and that's the issue. And of course, with the Maxwell tier list, you guys will definitely see what I'm talking about. Of course, we're going to be making updates. If they make any changes, we're going to make changes. But this is how it looks so far. All right. And so, one thing that could be really cool in these charms, I like this idea. This is not my own idea. I came up, my chat provided this idea. Very good idea, by the way. Is that to debuff stat variability would be good for encouraging people to chase the very best Sunder Charms, like with Geed's Fortune currently. So Geed's Fortune has variable stats, right? 80 to 160 gold find, 20 to 40 magic find, 10 to 15 vendor. These debuffs could be variable. And these debuffs are really cool thematically, by the way, because if you guys never played Diablo 1, they have items like this, where there's risk reward items that boost you, but they can also just get you killed. And I kind of like this thing, especially when it comes to hardcore. I can't state it enough. But what if instead of just a flat number, you actually give people a reason to find multiple of these charms and to chase like a really good version of this charm that maybe doesn't debuff you as much? Like maybe it's negative 50 to negative 75, or even like 65 to 85. You can even have it possibly be higher than the current value. Why not? Also, perhaps certain charms have different debuffs that reflect unique challenge for builds likely to use this charm. So it does feel like they kind of went the same route in terms of the same type of debuff for every damage type. But realistically speaking, not all of those debuffs hit every element the same. So, for instance, with fire, on a build that's using that fire charm and you're breaking every fire immune, you're usually going to want Flickering Flame anyway, so that you're reducing the resistance further, which also has Resist Fire Aura. So that's like a perfect couple, and then you get Resist Fire Aura with the Flickering Flame. What does Resist Fire Aura do? It completely negates the negative 75 fire resistance penalty. Completely negates it. It's like it doesn't exist, because Resist Fire gives so much fire resistance. And so it literally overtakes it even. Like it gives you plus fire res even with the debuff. And this is an item that you typically want to pair with the charm. So it almost feels like that this debuff is doing nothing for the fire build, if that makes any sense. And so like maybe on fire you would want a different debuff that challenges the build in general. Maybe it has an all resistance negative roll instead. For lightning, it might make sense to just have negative 75 lightning because, there's no massive amount of lightning res you're going to get on your typical negative enemy lightning items at all. As a matter of fact, lightning builds like to farm areas like Worldstone Keep, and those also tend to have the worst lightning damaged monsters as well. So that is a meaningful challenge for a lightning build, possibly. For the cold build, it's also possible the challenge is decent, but why not change it to something else? I mean, you can just make it something slightly different. Maybe it sets your defense to 0 or something. So even though you're a cold build, you can't use frozen armor or something. It just doesn't do anything. So you can't use your typical defensive skill. You'll have to use different defensive strategies. Maybe it increases damage done to health, so that energy shield is kind of negated a bit. I don't know. Like, you can do some very interesting things with this stuff. But the whole point is that maybe you can make it different depending on the element, not necessarily have the same debuff that just matches the element. That is unique for the types of builds that are likely to use the charm. So it gives you a unique risk reward that's a little more targeted and thus a little more effective. And so, like, with physical is just like, I don't know. Like, physical is one of those things where it's like, I think, like, you could create you could just lower that debuff, but you could also create a unique challenge as well. So it's not like they aren't unique in some way already by being a different element every time, but there's definitely some room to play around with those depending on what kind of build it is, to either maybe help out those builds that need more help, not to be hit harder, and maybe not to make it so easy for the lightning, cold, and fire builds that people already play and already like to totally take over the game. Make you maybe apply additional debuffs on those charms. I don't know. Make it particularly difficult. At any rate, maybe just make it unique. And I think that's the big thing, is just make it unique. Okay, so the last point I want to make here is that this is a possible idea. I'm not saying it's a good idea, but this is food for thought. So the rest of everything else, I stand behind 100%. This is kind of like, well, there is a little bit of a concern, okay? So there's a concern with power creep. So it's this concern that once you get the full effect of Infinity, for instance, on a lightning build, like especially Lightning Fury, even on lightning immunes, which is the only way to slow down a Lightning Fury Amazon before, besides, slow teleport, if that is gone, and now, like, those immunes are like negative 50 lightning res now, it's like, why do I need it's like, why do I need to care about what I'm farming at all? Why do I need to take a more nuanced approach? And so if the goal of these charms is to increase build diversity and to increase access to the terror zones and make it to where there's more ways to gain access to more terror zones besides just Infinity and lower resistance, or amp and decrep, things of that nature. If that's the case, you can argue that if a build already has amplify damage or decrepify or lower resist or conviction or grim ward, if they already have those and they're already breaking the immune with those, possibly the charm should take effect after, and thus it wouldn't take effect at all. Or you can give it a very limited effect, like maybe negative 10 or something from the charm if it is first broken by one of these. And what that would do is still make those endgame items stronger than the charm, but it wouldn't make it fully stronger than the charm, if that makes any sense. You could even have them break at half effectiveness if you want, instead of 1/5, and kind of like modify the penalty formula, which I think would be a lot simpler of a solution here. And so you can have conviction and lower res be a lot more effective. And then you can have the charm still be effective, even with lower resistant conviction, just not nearly as effective. And if there is no lower resistant conviction, it still does its 95 thing, which is fine. Reduces the immunity to 95 resistance. But currently, it does it first. So currently, the charm takes effect first, and so conviction and lower resist get their full effect, 100% of it afterwards, which just makes it to where in the end game, you can slaughter anything you want in Players 8, even if it's a lightning immune, which is kind of nuts. And it doesn't even feel like you're having to fight the lightning immunes. It feels like they're just like any other monster. Maybe that's a little bit too much. You can argue that as an endgame power fantasy where it is currently with these Sunder Charms is a good thing, because now the endgame power fantasy is even more extreme and awesome virtually for every build. Which is not a bad thing, because it means once you get all that gear, it's like, yeah, I absolutely flatten the game. But one thing I did kind of enjoy, or one thing I do enjoy about Diablo 2, is that even when you have the most powerful gear, there's some resistance to your damage. There's some challenge. There's some reasonable expectation that you can still die from something, especially if you're not taking the necessary precautions. And so, like, for me, the threat of getting so much and too much damage, no matter what your situation is a little cheapening the, you know, the making sure that the power creep is kept under control to some extent, and it's kind of coming a little bit undone and a little bit out of line. So something like changing the order and how these are calculated, or messing with the current conviction and lower resistance penalties might make sense here, so that you might still incur these penalties because they come first before the charm, and then the charm might not break the immune but just provide like a limited amount of negative enemy res instead. But now it's not the full 85 negative res, when a monster is immune. You know what I mean? It's yeah, once you get all that negative enemy res items, all those facets, all those room words and everything, the game is just gonna fall over. Even areas that were considered to be like extremely difficult, even with good gear. And so like this might make the game a lot more monotonous and boring in the end game, because you don't feel like you have to watch out or have to play in more interesting or hybrid or nuanced ways in general just to get past something, even with good gear. But once again, people do enjoy their extremely powerful endgame fantasies, so there is another side to this. So I'm not 100% sure where you guys are at. You guys can definitely you can definitely let me know in the comments what, of course, you guys think about all these things. So I went over what I'd like maybe polished or changed, what these don't change, what they do change, the Sunder Charms, and of course we started out with how they work. Of course, you guys including advanced information in case you didn't test them, so you want to know every single way that they apply or work. Now you know. But yeah, you can let me know in the comments below what you guys think. Of course, you can like and subscribe if you want more in-depth analysis videos like this one. 2+ hour long. I specialize in these ultra long guides, ultra long videos. You can definitely listen to them forever while you're doing whatever in the game or otherwise. If you thought this is amazing food for thought, I really hope so, because it really breaks down so many different aspects. There's always so many voices clashing on the internet, on the forums and whatnot. They're all arguing and coming together about all kinds of different issues, including the issue of, well, I didn't want these changes. I don't care about the 99 grind. I don't care about diverse builds or diverse areas being farmed. I just want quality of life. I just want the original game. I want my rune stacking or whatever it is, including that stuff. So it's and believe it or not, I want that stuff too. I think that quality of life would be good as long as you don't go too crazy with the quality of life and start changing, how you think about picking up items, like by creating a charm inventory or something like that. I'm usually behind it. I mean, I like charm inventories and mods, but to be honest, they kind of make generating gold in the early game kind of a joke. And they also make it to where picking up charms is also a joke because you use every single charm despite no matter how good or bad it is, pretty much, because you just have an inventory for it. It doesn't really like allow for nuanced decision making when it comes to picking that stuff up. But anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. That's just like all these other issues that people really come up with, and that's not. There's so many different things that feed into these discussions about like something that's such a big change to the game, and yet at the same time is still very situational, which is really the point of this discussion. Of course, we can continue this discussion in my stream at twitch.tv/Dark Humility, where, of course, we're going to continue producing content all the way up to ladder, and of course, we're going to be going hard for ladder 2. If you're looking for a team, make sure to sign up. Of course, you can check out the rest of my build guides and content here at maxwell.gg. And you can, I will try to post some timestamps as well, so you guys can see when I end each of these sections here below, so you guys can see exactly. You guys can track this discussion or skip various parts of the discussion in case you already know how they work and you just want me to know like what I think about what they change, what they don't change, and what I think they need to modify to really get the most out of these changes and to make the best out of these changes, if that makes any sense. Sunder Charms and Terror Zones. But at any rate, that's a wrap. Awesome, guys. If you guys stuck with me all the way till the end, you guys are beasts. I will see you guys next time. Let's get it. Dark Humility, over and out.